In this video, we're going over how to build Jumbotrons. Now, there's not a lot of HTML and not a lot of Bootstrap classes you need to know inherently to use the Jumbotron. There's really just one, the Jumbotron class. That's it. But what the Jumbotron class provides out of box is really not that much. So before we dive into what's provided out of the box, we really need to talk about what the purpose of the Jumbotron is. It's a really important control because it's going to be what the user sees first. And in fact, as it turns out, Bootstrap doesn't provide much out of the box because the assumption is you're going to need to actually provide a good amount of custom CSS to make the Jumbotron look the way that you need it to look. So the Jumbotron out of the box looks actually pretty ugly. What you need to do, so what you're going to need to do is add additional CSS to make it look the way that it should, to make it pop. But what we need to talk about first is what is the purpose of the Jumbotron and why is it so important? Why is it so important that it's the first thing that your users are going to see? So the Bootstrap Jumbotron is a very lightweight, flexible component used to showcase key marketing messages on your site. Okay, and the Bootstrap Jumbotron looks something like this. Okay, which is kind of a lie because actually the Bootstrap Jumbotron is just this gray box. That's the whole Bootstrap Jumbotron is really just that gray box. All the content inside of the Jumbotron is actually completely your own making, and in fact is all content that we've talked about previously. So let's talk about what the purpose of the Jumbotron is. Okay, so the purpose of the Jumbotron kind of goes back to this concept of the above the fold. What is above the fold? Well, this term originated with newspapers, and it originated due to them being printed on these very large sheets of paper, but then had to be folded once in order to put them in newsstands. So what you'd actually see when you went up to the newsstand would only be the top half of the front page, right? Whatever was on the bottom of that page, bottom of that front page, would be beneath the fold. Your client, the person who was buying the newspaper, wouldn't see what was beneath the fold until they actually picked up the newspaper. Or for instance, if it's in some sort of dispenser machine, you might actually have to put in a quarter to see the bottom, to actually get the newspaper, be able to pull it out and see the bottom of the page. So that top part of the newspaper, that top part of the front page, had to really sell the user, had to sell the passerby the idea that they should buy that newspaper, between, attention-grabbing headlines, content, imagery, all of these kind of things they want to put at the top of the page so that you go buy that newspaper. Well, a lot of that comes and applies in the digital world as well. But instead of a fold, instead of our paper being folded in half, what we have instead is the scroll bar. And the idea when we're talking about above the fold in digital world and in websites, we're talking about what is the content that appears without scrolling. So anything that the user has to see, everything that the user has to scroll to be able to see, is considered beneath the fold. Okay, anything that isn't visible immediately that requires scrolling is considered below the fold. Okay, so when the user is initially visiting your website, that's the first thing that they'll see. They'll see everything that's above the fold. Okay, that fold is generally considered to be about 400 to 600 pixels from the top of the viewport. Now, you could specify this in VH and say, I want to get 100 VH, and that would be a full amount of what's above the fold. The problem with using VH here is you tend to create false bottoms. if I say, let's make the top of this 100 VH, then oftentimes the user, it may look like there's nothing down below. So then we're going to have to indicate to the user that they need to scroll down further. So typically what we'll do is we're talking about Jumbotrons here. We'll typically have that Jumbotron be anywhere from 400 to 600 pixels tall. So we know it'll be at the top. It'll occupy a good amount of your viewport. But on desktop, it won't create that false bottom. And it's usually long enough to not also create that false bottom on mobile. So 400 to 600 is generally considered good. Again, you could use VH, but VH usually runs the problem that it creates a false bottom. But you can use it if you really do need to be precise about what is above the fold. So as you're thinking about what should be above the fold, one of the topics that we talk about in marketing in SEO is this idea of a conversion funnel. Okay, and the conversion funnel is the idea that we need to take the users from initially visit, maybe not even knowing about the website, down to taking an action, actually buying our product, right? Or subscribing to our newsletter, or contacting their senator, or whatever it may be that we want them to do. That's where we're trying to get them to. And as we kind of have to work them through that process, oftentimes you have people that fall off. So the funnel is always wider at the beginning and narrower at the end because people don't go all the way through your process. So the first thing we have to do in order to get users to take action and get them to buy things on our website is we have to first of all get their attention. We have to let them know about our website, okay? And we can let them know about our website through SEO, through ads, through marketing. There's all different ways to draw them into the website. Once they get into the website, we need to pique their interest with attractive visuals, video content, and a quick summary of what we're selling and what is this website about. Okay, and that content where we're piquing their interest, a lot of that content needs to be towards the top of the page, especially above the fold. But it doesn't necessarily have to be all above the fold. It has to start there, but it might continue further on if we can continue maintaining their interest. As they scroll down, we like to build a relationship of trust, and in that process, build a desire to purchase or take action on whatever we're selling or asking them, what to do. Things that we might include along that way are things like product comparison, case studies, testimonies. You might see some pricing in there, especially if we have a few different product lines or subscription tiers. You might see pricing there. You might see if we have a cause, if we're a nonprofit, we might explain, what we're doing and where that money is going, or how are we, what is the purpose of our being. Even if we're a corporation, we might have a cause. We might also talk about our history as we're working through this. All of this content that we're talking about, from interest to desire to action, a lot of this stuff usually is located on the first page of your website, typically on the home page. It doesn't have to be, but a lot of times that's kind of how we think about it. A lot of times that's how it works out best, especially for smaller websites, is you just have this process on the front page. But it can be throughout your website, there can be a lot more, there can be more pages that the user goes through as they work through this process. Finally, kind of at the end of this, we need to give them an action to take. So purchase, subscribe, etc. So sometimes you might hear the suggestion that your call to buy perhaps should be in that area above the fold. Sometimes that can be the recommendation depending on who you talk to. It's like, well, that may be, that's a lot of times where you see a call to action is up in the Jumbotron area. Now, that's not always the best choice, and there's some articles linked here that talk about more about different considerations that you should make, and what maybe sometimes it's effective to have it up there, and sometimes it's not. If you're a large company like, say, Apple, and people already know who you are, then having that call to action in your Jumbotron is great. But for most companies, especially if you don't know, if your average user does not know who you are when they get to your website initially, you're probably going to put that call to action down further in the page. So call to action in the Jumbotron at the top of the page is typically for your existing returning users, but a call to action further down in the page would be for your users that are new. Okay. So a few lessons that we've learned from looking at newspaper and looking at what works and what doesn't. We know that presenting attention-grabbing headlines, content, and imagery above the whole fold, especially on the home page, particularly on the home page, is really a good idea to draw users in. And that means that we're going to use those principles when we build our Jumbotron. We want large headlines. We want to have that content there be attention grabbing, but it should also be short. You don't want a lot of words and content up there. But we also want to make sure that we're using imagery. Just using plain colors or gradients is not generally a good thing in your Jumbotron. You generally want to have an image there. It's also great to use large font sizes above the fold. So you might use smaller font sizes as you go down, but your font sizes should be quite large when you're displaying things in the Jumbotron. We want to use background image, maybe gradients, definitely not solid colors when we're working with Jumbotrons. Animated graphics and video are also great things to put in the Jumbotron, any area above the fold, to draw users in immediately. And then sometimes you'll see, again, call to action somewhere on the top of the home page, but that's largely for returning users more so than new clients. Okay, so let's build a really, really simple Jumbotron. So if I want to say a simple Jumbotron, I'm going to start with a container, and then I'm going to put the Jumbotron inside of it. Now in this case, remember the container typically doesn't take up the full width of the page. So in this case, my Jumbotron would not take up the full width of the page. It's going to just take up the full width of the container. Okay. Here I've given a background of dark and text of white. So I'm using those utility classes that we've seen before. That's completely optional. I can make the background color whatever I want it. I can make the text color whatever I want it. But I'm using background dark here to create a contrast, background dark and text white, to create contrast between the text and that. Then inside of that, you'll see I have an H1, and I've given it a class of display4. So you'll remember that there's the classes. If I want to change the font sizes, there's a few classes available: display1, display2, display3, display4. Those each change and affect the font size, and they're actually bigger than H1. I can apply those without having this be an H1. This could easily enough here just be a div. But I am adding that potentially for semantic reasons. I kind of may want the semantics of an H1 here, but it doesn't have to be an H1. So display4 is what's making the text actually much larger, and all of those from display1 to display4, all of those are actually bigger than an H1. Okay, so you can use those to get much larger font sizes in your Jumbotron. But that's really the only place most of the time you want to use the display 1 through 4 is anytime you're showing something in the Geometron. I would avoid that large font size for most other things. So we can see the text in there is 20% off store-wide. So I'm making this you're saying, hey, there's a big discount. Well, it might be a big discount, and saying, okay, you really want to purchase something here. Below that, I've got a button, and I've marked it's actually a link. It's anchor tag because it's going to take them to another page. And then I've given it the class as button primary, but I've also given it button large because I want this to be a large button. Button large is a really good thing to add for any button. If you do have it in your Geometron, absolutely make it a large button. We're telling it this is a roll button. That roll there is to signal screen readers to treat it as a button. Which I don't know in this case. This case it's debatable whether or not that should be there, I think. So we have our big button there, and that would be, if I wanted to create a call to action, I would kind of create it that way. Okay, now this is pretty simple, but remember, as I said previously, we have a container on the outside and then the Jumbotron on the inside, so this is not going to be the full width of the screen. If I switch these and I add a class called Geometron Fluid, you'll notice that the Geometron normally has rounded corners, and that works well if it doesn't fit the full width of the page. But oftentimes I want to expand my Geometrons to fill the full width of the viewport. In order to do that, I need to actually switch the container and the Geometron. So rather than the Geometron being inside of the container, I want the container to be inside of the Geometron. So here I have on the outside, I have Geometron. I also have this class Geometron Fluid. That Geometron Fluid removes the rounded corners and also stretches it to 100% width of the view. So that's what I want to do if I wanted a full banner ad, as you might say. The container then goes inside, and that's all I have to do to switch that. Is basically switch the order of the two and then add Geometron Fluid. So let's look at a more complicated Jumbotron, and this is where if you want to actually make your Jumbotron look good, you can't just take the Jumbotron classes in of themselves. In fact, to really make a good Jumbotron, you are going to have to write some custom CSS, and then that's okay. Your Jumbotron is a small part of your page, but it's the first thing that user sees. It's well worth your time to write a little bit of custom CSS for it. It will pay dividends. It is worth it. So a lot of times you remember that really Bootstrap is focused on reducing how much custom CSS we have to write. But in the case of specifically a Geometron, the time and crafting that we take to build a good look and feel is really worth it. So here I've taken that example that I had previously. I've added my own class here, example Jumbotron, and what I'm now doing is I'm applying all this custom CSS on top of the Bootstrap CSS to this example Jumbotron. You'll also notice that I've removed the background dark and the text white because I'm going to be doing those kind of things in my own CSS. So let's look at what I have here. So example Geometron. This is what I'm going to end up making it look like. And a few things you'll notice. I've added an image as the background. I've also added a drop shadow to the text here and a drop shadow to the button here. Both of those things to make it pop, as well as to set it off from the image. If I didn't add a drop shadow to both of those things, it would be very hard to read the text or kind of tell where the edge of the button is. So adding drop shadows to your content in the Jumbotron is usually a good thing, especially if you have an image as a background. So let's look at what I'm applying. So to the Jumbotron itself, which is this outer layer, I'm giving it a color of white, and remember that text color is inherited down to all the controls inside of it. So that's why this text is becoming white, and this text on the button is also white. Actually, no, that one's white because of the BTN primary. I take that back. But that's making the text here white. So that color I pick needs to be contrasting to the image. So because I have a black and white image, it's largely black, at least in half of it, I'm using a white. So I've got the color white, I've got the background image set to an image, I've got the repeat set to no repeat because I only want one copy of this image. I absolutely don't want it to tile. I'm positioning it in the center, and then I'm using this background size of cover. Remember we talked about that maybe earlier. The whole point of that is I don't want there to be any empty space where the image is not covering. So I'll expand or contract, I'll change the resize the image until it covers the entire area of the Jumbotron. That is very important if you're going to give a background image to your Jumbotron, and you should definitely set background size cover. I'm also giving it a minimum height of 400, and remember we talked about the idea that you're above the fold area is typically somewhere around 400 to 600. So you need to give a minimum height to your Jumbotron, and it should be anywhere there from 400 to 600, depending on what makes the most sense for your content. I'm also making a flex container, so I can have flex controls of it. I'm changing it to a flex column so that things are arranged vertically. I'm giving it justify content center, and that's one, and a line item center. And both of those things are going to ensure that all of the content inside of my Jumbotron ends up centered inside of the Jumbotron. One thing to remember here, notice I'm setting a minimum height. That's going to force it to be at least that tall, could be taller. But you always want to set a minimum height to your Jumbotron because otherwise it's going to only be the height of the content. So to really draw the user's attention, you typically need some what we call maybe negative space, some area where you don't have content. So by setting the minimum height, I really encourage there to be that extra space where there's not content, which makes the content more pronounced. Next up, I'm giving a little bit of styling to the H1 that's inside of the Geometron. I'm giving that a font weight of bolder, so you can see the text is bold, definitely bold. And finally, I've got a text shadow. So that shadow is what's giving it this extra drop shadow on the text. The 2 pixels and 2 pixels, both of those have to do with the offset in the vertical and horizontal direction. So it's 2 pixels to the right and 2 pixels down from wherever the text is. That determines how far away the shadow is from the actual text. You want to keep that pretty small in general because it's disconcerting if you have a very large distance. The bigger it is, though, that kind of generally looks like a further different, makes it look like the text is farther away from the background, the farther those are away. I would say, though, you kind of need to tune that spacing, the amount of distance for the shadow, based on how big the text is. So if you're using a smaller font size, you may want a smaller offset. If you're using a bigger text size, I usually find that I need a bigger offset. But in this case, I've kept both of those at 2, and you can see it's actually fine even at a fairly large font size. Okay. Next up, we've got, I'm applying some styling to the button. You see .btn, the button that is inside of my Jumbotron. Specifically, I'm targeting example Jumbotron. And I'm giving it a font weight of bolder, similar to what I did with the H1, and I'm giving it a box shadow. So text shadow is what I apply a shadow to text. Here I'm getting a box shadow. So what you're seeing is it's on the box, the outside of the button, instead of the shadow being on the outside of the text. Okay, so that's the text. Makes the button looks like it's sticking out. And you'll notice that I've used a bigger offset for the button than I have for the text, and that creates this effect that effectively the button is sticking further out than the text. So you can change that depending on what you want to look like it's sticking further out of the screen. But I would make sure you keep those offsets small. 2 and 4 pixels are usually pretty good numbers. Any more than that can make the text harder to read. And also make sure that your shadows are black. You can technically set the shadow to any color, but black is usually the best because it creates that sort of appearance to actually be a shadow. I could set the shadow to purple or yellow or red or white or whatever I want to do. But I do for sure need to make sure that whatever the color of the shadow is contrasting with the color of the text, for instance, whatever's above it. Okay, so that's how I can apply some custom CSS to make a Jumbotron that looks a lot better. So use those tools as you're building your own Jumbotrons. It's really, if you're going to build a Geometron, if you're going to use it and have it be effective, you do actually need to spend some time writing your own CSS and playing around with it to get it to the place that makes sense for the particular project that you're selling. So what might work for a Geometron for one company may not, or for one ad, might not work best for another ad. So another thing to keep in mind as you're styling these Jumbotrons, don't target the Jumbotron class itself. Create another class. So here I've targeted example Jumbotron and target that. Because more often than not, you'll at some point find that you have more than one Jumbotron on your website, and no two Jumbotrons are really likely going to be the same. So this is how I've set up my Jumbotron, but your Jumbotron will probably be different. Although I would recommend keeping some of these principles regardless of what Jumbotron you build. So for instance, make sure the minimum height is always 400 to 600. Make sure you typically want a background image and set that background to no repeat, center, and cover. Those are things that pretty much uniformly work well. Not with all images. You might have to edit the image to get it to the point where it works that way. But these are good general recommendations. And then I also usually want to apply shadows both to the text as well as to any buttons that I have. So that's the end of this video, and I will see you again next time.